You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to On the Way Home, the podcast where we explore the ideas, research, and leadership shaping the future of housing across Canada. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly. Today, I'm joined by Adam Mongrain, Director of Housing Policy at Ville. Adam has become one of the clearest voices in Canada on structural housing issues, from costs versus prices to supply reform to the systems level changes needed to move us towards a fairer, more functional housing landscape. His path into housing wasn't linear, beginning in software development and project management, but it's given him a unique analytical lens on the policies and systems that shape where and how people live. Special thanks to Adam for being here. Let's listen in. Welcome to On the Way Home, Adam. We're so excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to start with our signature question. What does home mean to you?
I'll try not to take too much time with my answer to this first icebreaker question, but it means a lot. For me, home is the essential condition for things that we try to bring about with our work in the housing space, which is liberty and dignity for everyone. Because I do think that you need a place to live. You need to have a place that you call home, to be free, to be who you are, to associate with the people you want to associate with, and to say what you want to say. So I think home is the fundamental piece for the liberty and dignity of everyone that is with us in these places.
And you've had a really interesting path into housing policy, coming from software development and project management. For listeners meeting you for the first time, can you walk us through what brought you into this world of housing?
I will say luck. All the while I was doing these other things, software development and freelancing and manual work, the entire time I was not really paying attention to what I was supposed to be doing. I was thinking about housing because I was exposed to ideas about housing and how housing is a determinant of almost everything. Maybe in 2011, that was the first time while I was working at Yellow Pages back then, and I was reading articles on the news during the day, and I saw this first proposition that housing matters more than I thought it did. And the way that we decide who gets to live where and the ways that people can make these choices are actually things we can change. It's not a natural law. We can shape outcomes in housing. And ever since I picked that up in 2011, I just never stopped thinking about it. And I had no actual training. I had no background in urbanism or real estate development. I just thought about that 24/7 for upwards of 10 years. And the org I worked with, Vivre, was doing advocacy for sustainable development at regional scales. And they were running into the problem that in Quebec, where it was considered affordable for so long, the wheels were flying off, and what we had taken for granted in terms of affordability was not happening as much as it did. We were seeing price increases that were outpacing inflation by a lot. So that org decided that they needed to get smart about housing policy to find ways that they could still do sustainable development without incurring those price increases. And I just lined up. Among other people, which were maybe more conventionally qualified for this work. And I said, I've been thinking about this nonstop forever. Please let me work on this. And they did. I'm very happy and grateful that this is what I do now.
That's very cool. And you'll have to, so for the listeners, I heard Adam do a presentation, and it's was very clear. Adam was a great teacher, and I learned so much. So I'm hoping that we can tap into that brain of yours that seems to have always had that interest and focus on housing. So you do talk about the difference between cost problems and price problems in housing. Can you explain what that means and why separating the two matters?
Yeah. For most people, there's no real difference between costs and prices. Like, you will talk about the cost and the price of a tomato, and it's going to be the same amount of dollars. In economics, when we get into all the artifice of economics, there's a distinction between costs and prices, and costs usually are what it cost, that's the word, for firms to produce goods and services. So a cost of the tomato would be the amount of dollars representing labor, taxes, everything else that goes into producing one tomato. Whereas the price of a tomato would be what it goes for when it's accessible to consumers. And in housing, that means that there is a distinction there for the cost of producing housing, so how much it costs to build a house, and the price of housing, how much it costs to buy a house when you're a consumer. And one of the reasons I bring this up often and usually early in my presentations is that so much of our housing conversation is focused on costs. We're trying to drive down the price of production in housing for good reason, because right now they are crazy expensive to build our houses compared to what they used to cost to build. So we need to find ways to actually bring down the cost of housing in new production. But it's not enough. And I think that one of the reasons why it's so important to me is that most of us, almost all of us, are going to build in old homes, are going to live in old homes. And in that regard, even if we solve the problem of costs in new construction, that is still going to represent a fraction, maybe 1 or 2% of the entire housing supply. So that means that we can drive down how much it costs to increase a tiny bit the housing supply, but most of us are going to be facing prices, not costs. And so we need to have a separate or a more global approach to the problem of housing service consumption that factors in how much it costs to build, but also how prices are set. So how much people are expected to pay, not just for new homes, but for old homes.
Thank you for that. And once you separate costs and prices, how do they interact with each other in ways that shape the housing crisis?
That's the really maddening part, because you would think, okay, well, these things are separate, so they don't really interact. Like you could solve the cost problem and you can solve the price problem. But the thing is that they probably are linked. And they're linked in ways that are sometimes counterintuitive, but sometimes really evident, which is that if you want to build a new house, you need to put it somewhere. So for almost everywhere in Canada, that means that they need to purchase land. The price of land is not related to the price of production of land because land is already produced. So what sets the price of land is essentially price signals in the existing home market. If your homes in a neighborhood are going for $1 million and you have an empty lot in that neighborhood on which you can build a house, well, the worth of that lot, the price of that lot, is probably going to be close to $1 million minus the cost of construction. And all of these informations are available to builders and sellers of real estate and land. So that means that as the price of homes, which is not the price of production of producing new homes, but the price of homes generally increases, that also increases the costs of building new homes. So if we just concentrate all of our efforts on cost or on prices, we're still going to see costs and prices spiraling out of the means of everyday people, which is essentially the shortest description of the housing crisis that we're seeing everywhere in Canada.
It's a mind bend. I'm thinking for me to like follow that, and I'm sure listeners as well. Do you think that part of Canada's challenge is that we keep misdiagnosing the issue, sometimes treating a cost problem like a price problem, or the reverse? Because like even when you're talking it, like I'm trying to make sure I'm following each of the problems.
Yeah, I will say maybe the easiest way to think about the subject, the way that we're trying to think about it, is that the really tricky problem is the price of old homes. It's not the price of new construction, because there are things we should and can do with the price of new construction. But if we don't want to deal with the problem of how much homes that were built 50 years ago cost now, the construction cost of all of those homes is paid for. It was paid for maybe 25 years ago, and the amount of dollars that went into building that home is so much smaller than the amount of dollars we have to shell out now to build a new home. And now these homes are everywhere being sold for maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 times the amount of money that went into their original construction. And that inflation, that increase in prices from the moment of construction for most of our housing stock, is essentially making it impossible for new buyers to buy the price of a new home, because these two things move together. And I think the problem with our diagnosis is that even when we think about increasing supply, even when we think about social housing, even when we think about rent control, a large missing piece is how much it costs to just buy a regular old home that is already paid for. And that's really demanding, because that if we want to take this problem seriously, if you want to say, well, how much a home that costs $50,000 to build is now going on the market for $800,000? And we're serious about considering this a problem. Well, that means that it's probably too expensive. And if it's too expensive, it's easy in theory, but it's hard in practice, because that home is not public property. It's not newly built. It's not empty waiting for its first buyer. Someone is in there, and that person is probably the owner of that home. And you are going to be in a situation where you're going to tell, maybe you bought this home for 400K and now it's on the market for 800K, but it's a mistake. It should not have happened. You probably should not be able to sell your home for that much money. And people are going to be extremely defensive for good reason about such a proposition, because for decades now, we kind of agreed that this is what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to get into real estate, you're supposed to get your own home, and it increases in value, it increases your wealth, your household wealth, and things are going better for you than if you were not in the homeowner market. And everyone agrees that this is the way it should be. When you open the conversation to think, well, maybe this was a mistake, to let things get out of control, let things spiral out of control that much, that means that you're trying to put that, you're trying to unwind time, to rewind time. And you're doing it not with governments, you're not doing it with builders, you're not doing it with, interested experts and parties. You're doing it with regular old folks who have come to expect that their homes would increase in price, and they don't really want to consider not accessing this wealth now that it exists.
Yeah, or they might actually be like counting on it for retirement. Or so how, like, in a do you vision like a solution around that to like reduce or limit price?
Well, there's a lot of things that would work. Like you could pass some really mean taxes that would decrease prices, but you're going to hurt a lot of people, and there's going to be essentially no popular demand for these policies. I think that the problem of savings, which you just brought up, is real. Like, people need some way to protect themselves against future hardship, and that in our case, for most of us, that means extra money on hand so that you can still, to the point I made earlier, be free with your life when you grow older. You want to be able to choose where you live, how you live, with whom you live, and for that right now, people need money. So if we don't address the residential options and essentially the lifestyle options of people who are going to be going to stop working eventually, then essentially you're just pulling the rug from beneath people and telling them, well, we made a mistake, building the world as we did, but now you're on your own and you need to figure out options for yourself. And I don't think that's fair. And I don't think that, not only is it not fair, it's probably not possible to essentially try to change everything in one fell swoop like that. Too many people are going to get hurt, too many things are going to go sideways, so it's not a plausible solution. There needs to be something that we do about what living conditions we can guarantee to people who are not dependent on their real estate wealth, so that they can still make choices. But that's a separate problem. And it's not a problem that we can solve with housing policy. We could make the cost of living in places cheaper, which is going to reduce the need to have so much money. But otherwise, we probably need separate policies and separate work going into how do we protect the living conditions of people even when they don't have household wealth. if we manage to get it, though, if we manage to solve the savings problems or the deteriorating living conditions problem, there are things we could do for prices. If we manage to keep the vacancy rate essentially or the resale inventory very high for very long, that does two things. It provides a lot more options to everyone. And with more options, what we've seen in places where these things have happened, either the inventory or the vacancy rate, prices go down by themselves. Because one of the reasons why prices increases so much is competition between interested buyers. And when you spread out those buyers on a larger inventory, especially an extremely abundant inventory, I don't mean like a couple extra homes, I mean a lot. That in places where that is the case, you actually see homes decrease in price over time, which is the complete inverse of what we are right now. You can buy a home, do nothing with it, and it will increase in price over time because there's too many interested people lining up to buy the home that you have to live in that place. So either we do it quickly with taxes and fiscal policy, which is going to be a hard sell, which could be facilitated with real work going into savings and retirement and other options for people. And when we actually get all of our ducks lined in a row, we can, change the price trajectories for old homes with a counter offer in newly constructed homes.
So what would you like from your seat and all this analysis you've done, what would be like your recommendation if you could wave a magic wand?
It's going to be 4 recommendations because I do think that this problem that we have is too dynamic to change one thing and not see the pressure move from one problem to the other. And the way we've tried to frame this for people to make, give something tangible, give something really actionable to our electeds or to people, is that 4 things need to happen at once if we want to move forward solving the housing crisis sustainably. First thing is that there needs to be more space, living space, than there are people in sustainable communities. And it's going to take like a lot of labor and a lot of work and a lot of investment to get there. But the most important barriers that we have to solve to create this living spaces in sustainable communities is mostly infrastructure and regulation. Right now, in places where people want to live, usually there are not enough homes, and part of the reason why there are not enough homes is that you can't build them because there's no connection to either roads or power or wastewater treatment, or the law says that you cannot actually build a new home. So we need to overcome these hurdles and create residential capacity, potential space, what Shane Phillips calls a zoning buffer. So like a real difference between the existing use of a neighborhood or a city and the capacity that we give ourselves to grow and change. Second thing that needs to happen is that we need to make it more profitable to build homes than to own homes. And that's tricky because that means that we probably have to attack the profitability of owning homes at the same time that we give additional incentives for construction and renovation, and essentially increasing the quantity or quality of housing that is available to people. Third thing, which is growing more and more popular, but I don't think we're really wrestling with the implications yet, is that we need to flood the market with social, community, and nonprofit housing. Not because they're mean, not because they're evil, not because they're trying to make things worse, but the private sector usually kind of self-organizes into undersupplying the market, because if you're building homes, that carries a great deal of risk. It's super expensive right now to build a home. In a lot of places, it can cost upwards of $600,000 just in costs to put a 1 or 2 bedroom condo on the market. And almost everyone that does that borrows that money. So if you are going to build, and you're going to build 24 units that all go for 600K each. That means an incredible amount of debt. If you can't sell these, you are going to be on a hook for way more money than you have in your pocket. So that means that the best strategy to make sure that you actually go to market and sell all of your units is to make sure that there's a lot of demand for those units. And one of the ways that you make sure that there's a lot of demand for those units is not to overbuild. So every time the private sector, because they're not completely coordinated, overbuilds, they react by stopping construction. And again, this is not because they're trying to make things worse. It's just that the incentives that they face as individual actors does not reward overbuilding. So this is something that I know is happening right now in Toronto. There is right now an oversupply in Toronto, and construction activity has slowed down a lot in reaction because no one wants to be on the hook for those tens of millions of dollars for unsold inventory. If we want to see more, that residential capacity transform itself into actual residential space so that people have options about where they live and how they live, the best engine of change that we have is probably nonprofit housing and social housing and public housing, because that does not come with the imperative to turn a profit or to repay your debt quickly. If we agree that we should put public dollars there, of course, we could do subsidized housing so that at the moment of construction, the rents are cheaper than they would be if they just paid for cost. But we can also say that right now there is so much demand to live in places where there are jobs, where there are services, where there are amenities, where there are parks. We can just build housing there and put it on the market at cost, and it would sell itself. And if it doesn't, it's not a big deal because those are public finances. And if the building is well built and the asset is healthy, it's going to, become useful eventually, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. We can actually upend the logic of scarcity that makes the private sector, that essentially drives the private sector. And the fourth thing that needs to happen is that for all of this to make sense, we need to find a way to make it easier to build good quality housing. This is not something we talk about a lot because it's not always visible to us, but Canada is amongst the worst place in the world to build a home with a set amount of dollars. It's crazy expensive to build in Canada. It's gotten more expensive everywhere, but there's almost nowhere where it has gotten as expensive in a short amount of time as Canada. And a lot of that has to do with the way that we build and the ways that we think about housing and what we set as minimums and maximums in housing. And there are places where they actually manage to build nicer units than we do that, stay healthy and are easier to insure and easier to heat and cool down than what we allow ourselves, and they do that with a different way of building, a different way of planning construction, and we have to import those practices and those ideas into our industry, because even if we do the three first things I talked about, if we keep having to pay $1 million for a boring home, we're going to run out of money. So we need to drive down costs in order for all of that to make sense.
Do you think our climate has anything to do with perhaps how lagging we are on technologies, or do we see are you seeing countries or geographies where climate matches Canada's and they are successful with new technology?
Yeah, of course. Of course, what you get in Sweden in terms of driving down costs is a lot of interoperable prefabricated pieces, which are able, of course, to withstand winter. But essentially, a lot of firms are going to produce panelized flooring or panelized walls. And all of those pieces can go together because they agree on a standard. So that means that upwards of 60% of every input in new construction in Sweden comes from prefabricated industries. That drives down the amount of labor that goes into assembling a house on site, and even the amount of materials that you need to buy to produce those panels, because they can essentially keep improving productivity in their factories. In Switzerland, which is also a place that has some amount of cold and snow and Nordicity, their construction prices are also very low. And one of the reasons because they work with a different building code, but there's a lot that goes into keeping those costs low. The most dramatic example of this is how much it costs to build an elevator in Switzerland relative to Canada, and it's a factor of four. They managed to build elevators that do the same job that our elevators do, with 25% money in hard costs, which it costs us in Canada. So those savings are real and they're available, and they're coherent with the climate that we have in Canada. There might be ways or places in which we cannot fully replicate the savings that we see overseas. But there is so much ground to gain that it should not be a hard stop for us to think about our reality and our climate and think that it's not worth the effort.
So back to the elevator for a minute. That is a shocking number that tells us a lot about why cost and price are higher. What, like in the example of the elevator, what's the difference? Like, what do we have? What's amiss for us? Is it just about not embracing new technology, or?
Not quite. And it's hard to actually say what the problem is without sounding a bit abstract or conspiracy minded. But a lot of it is the minimum set by our building codes. And I'm going to give a quick overview of the building code that we have. The building code that we have, set by the federal government Canada, is inspired in large part by the work that is being done by the International Code Council. That organization name is a misnomer because the International Code Council is a nonprofit which is associated with no government that is based in the United States. And their work is the basis of exactly two codes in the world, which is the Building Code of the United States and the Building Code in Canada. And that's the international part. When they draft those requirements for building codes in the US, the way that they go about it is that they take comments from builders themselves and from sellers of materials and trades, essentially. And they will put out a request for comment on things like, what is the minimal amount of emergency lighting you would need in a bathroom? And the person that is showing up to that consultation is someone that sells emergency lighting for bathrooms. And it's not that they're trying to make things worse. Again, it's just that, of course, they have an incentive to say that the minimal amount required is probably higher than what the rest of us would think, because they have an incentive to make that minimum as high as possible, because that means more business for them. Every part of our building code has been in some ways influenced by that drafting process. And we keep making things bigger and more redundant and more necessary. And that's a lot of labor and that's a lot of materials that go into the minimum acceptable building in Canada. And if you look just at the number of pipes that you would get in new construction, usually in places like Germany, when you're doing like a multi-residential building and there are bathrooms in each unit on a four-story building, they will use the same piping to collect water from the sink and the bath. That's not always the case with buildings that are built according to the American code. Sometimes you will need parallel pipes to collect water from the sink and the bath. And that's just the one thing, but that's twice the amount of piping. And that goes into what we consider the minimum acceptable amount of piping in our buildings. So that, maybe you increase the hard cost for your new construction by $5,000 or $4,000. And in itself, we can absorb that. Like if the homes go from 1 million to 1,004,000, that doesn't make a huge difference. But the problem is that everything lines up to increase the base cost of everything. And that ends up showing up in dramatic numbers, like how you can build a fully functioning elevator in Switzerland for essentially 50,000 Canadian dollars, whereas in Canada, it costs 200 Canadian dollars. And those things add up.
I love this podcast because I feel like I'm sitting here doing a puzzle when I talk to different guests, and you add like a whole new perspective and looking at this. And you've emphasized the need to build a broad movement in support of structural changes before asking for sacrifices from politicians or household. Why is that sequence so important?
Well, the thing is that I go to a lot of events with private sector actors, with public sector actors, with community sector actors, and everyone, even the private actors, which are not doing super well in a lot of places in Canada right now, will take the stage and make the point that there needs to be political will and political courage to bring about the necessary changes to the industry, to the housing stock, to the housing outcomes. And it's true because the things that we will have to change to essentially solve the puzzle that you're working on yourself will be difficult things. There's going to be some arbitration. Some people will be worse off in terms of where their options are right now. And maybe that means that all of the homes that they can consider are going to be smaller than the homes that they wish they had. Not making people move from a small condo to a tiny condo, but maybe offering residential options, even for families, which look more like things you would find in Belgium and Switzerland and in France than what we're seeing in Canada and the US. Maybe some people will not have a dedicated parking space because parking takes up so much space, and space is so scarce and so valuable in cities and places where people want to live that it will maybe not make as much sense to dedicate so much space to parking. And all of these things are going to be, in some ways, unpopular or controversial. This is what we're asking our politicians to do. We're asking them to essentially take it upon themselves to bring about monumental change in the ways and things that people take for granted. And I do believe that they will. I absolutely think that the scale and the gravity of the problems that we have in housing are going to lead to some difficult changes along the way. There was a talk at the Boulder YIMBY event in 2016 by Alex Steffen, which essentially made the case very convincingly that things are going to go. Like we are going to lose some things that we take for granted because of climate change, because of changes in the way that we live and our options. And these things are either going to happen by themselves through force, or we can change to manage this change and to welcome it. It's going to happen. If we want to say in what happens, that means that we need to create space for our politicians to take controversial decisions. Because politicians usually get into politics because they want to change things. That is a core motivation of getting in that position as elected. If you want to change things, you need a mandate. You need to know that the people that put you in power are not going to take that power from you when you do the things that you want to do, because then it changes your own incentive as a politician. Like you might have gotten into politics because you wanted to get rid of corruption, but then you find out that getting rid of corruption means that you need to piss off everyone that voted for you for some reason or some other, and then it becomes extremely difficult, even if that's what you thought you wanted to do, to actually do it. So people like you and me and everyone that we talk to, not just in housing events, but our families, our friends, our colleagues, need to hear that if they're serious about solving the housing problem, they need to not get mad that quickly. They need to actually signal that they're ready, that they actually are willing to go through the motions, that friction, that imperfection, that risk and that failure of actually bringing about structural change, and that the politicians that do show political courage and political will are not going to get immediately punished by their constituencies when they do show up with that courage that we're asking out of them.
Tough challenges ahead. And you've also been pushing for a rental registry for years. Why is it so important?
Well, one of the, separating costs and prices for 1 second, one of the problems we have in prices, and it's something that's been documented in, I think, two distinct Nobel Prizes, is the asymmetry of information. Usually, when we think about how things are supposed to work in markets and the economy, we kind of assume that everyone has all the information that they need to essentially make by their consumption choices, send the right signal to the market so that the market can produce more of one good or one services according to what consumers are doing. And one of the most important problems with that logic is that consumers usually can't know everything about what they're consuming. In rental markets, one of the big problems is that, you might have heard that for every new affordable home that we build, we're losing tens or 30 or 40. Well, those homes are not destroyed. They're still there. What changes is their price. So you would have a unit that used to go for $800 a month, and the next time it shows up on the market, it's going to go for $1,600 or $2,000. But it's the same unit, and most of the time that unit is fully paid for. The construction costs don't factor into their price anymore because it's been built for a while. So there is a price to property management, there is a price to financing, insurance, but the hard costs, which make up so much of the problems we have in new construction, that's not a factor in the price of apartments that were built in the 80s and 90s, even in the early 2000s now that we're here. And consumers can't discriminate when they're choosing where to live. Right now, they don't have a lot of options, but in ideal conditions, they can't discriminate when they're facing those prices by the price history. They can't figure out what's the amount of work that went into this unit that makes that price make sense. A lot of times, they only see the price, and they don't know that essentially that increase in price between two tenants reflects no increase in value. What has become more valuable is the opportunity to live in one place relative to what it cost some time ago. But what happens when every time that happens, that someone will pay for a unit twice the price it used to go for, and the unit itself does not change, does not increase in quality, is that we're rewarding ownership of property instead of the increase in quality or quantity of housing that is available. So a rental registry is not going to solve this problem entirely. It won't have the effect of an atomic bomb, but it will increase symmetry of information so that it gives new options to consumers to discriminate, maybe with a tiny bit more options when they're choosing their where they want to live, in places where they're having policies in place to increase the symmetry of information. Usually, it works out to the advantage of consumers. The most important book for this problem is called "For the Market for Lemons," and it used to be that when you were buying a used car, you could be buying a lemon. That's the source of that title, because you did not know anything about that car's history. And it used to be a huge problem because you could not trust the seller with the information they gave you. Maybe the car you're buying has had their mileage tampered, maybe it's been in accidents, maybe the previous owner did not do their oil changes for 20 years. You didn't know. And there are now a slate of measures, either private measures or public measures, that try to give consumers more information about used cars. Because that problem was so bad and it led to so many bad outcomes that the market itself and public governments decided to move into that space and provide more information to consumers. And right now, it is much safer in 2025 to buy a used car than it used to be 50 or 40 or 30 years ago. So giving more information to up the symmetry of information is going to work to the benefit of consumers first and markets generally.
At Ville, am I saying that right, your organization?
You are.
Yay. You work alongside experts from research, nonprofit development, planning, and the co-op movement. What have you learned about the power of cross-sector collaboration in solving housing problems?
There is a cliche phrase in French, but it's become a cliche because it's true, which is Tout seul on va vite, mais ensemble on va loin. Which translates roughly to alone we can go quickly, but together we can go far. And I think that considering that everyone has a problem that they're chipping away with in the sector, and the dynamism and complexity of the problem that we're trying to work on together, it absolutely takes everyone, bringing their brick, doing their part for us to make real movement together. When we did our original research in 2020, essentially we were very naive with it. We reached out to private builders, public builders, municipalities, architects, tenant unions, everyone that is generally in the housing space. And we asked them, what could we do to make the proportion of housing that is sustainable also affordable? And what we got is 531 answers that essentially, if you step back and look at all the problems, those 500 plus problems with that question, you come to the conclusion that it's impossible. Because all of these things are true. Everyone told us the real reason why it was not possible with the thing that they were working on right now. And when you look at that in the aggregate, you go, well, everything needs to change. If you try to solve any one of these problems, you're left with more than 500 problems. So the only way that you can make housing affordable and sustainable is you change everything. And to change everything, you need to talk to everyone, because everything is just a function of all the work that is being done by different parties with different interests and different imperatives everywhere in the sector. So I really do think that to do useful work, it needs to be a sectoral effort, essentially a society-wide effort to try and all of us make a small difference that essentially bundles up and becomes a real structural movement for different housing outcomes.
Adam, you're such a clever guide, so knowledgeable in this space. I'm going to end by asking you, what brings you hope about the situation and the housing landscape right now, and what do you see as the biggest opportunity that we can focus on as a nation?
Yeah. I will say, like, in my experience, the smartest housing people are usually in the worst housing markets. And it's been the case that as things have gone worse in Canada, the quality of conversation, the quality of ideas, the quality of actors, the quality of proposal has also gone up, because the low-hanging fruits have been picked. We're running into these walls, we're running into all these frictions and challenges, and so we have to get smarter about it, and we are. I will say that work that is being done in BC, work that is being done in Quebec, work that is being done in Toronto is actually at the scale of sophistication and the scale of courage and refinement that I think is productive to make real headway with our problems. So it had to get this bad before we got this good at actually solving these problems. But now we're getting there. We're talking with each other, and people are actually coming up with real clever ways to actually chip away at it. And that brings me enormous hope. And it's sad because, it would have been much easier to stop this problem from happening in the first time. Like, if we had a time machine, all of our problems would be solved. Like, let's not do everything that we've done for 30 years, but we've done it now. And so we're left with this reality. We're left with essentially this legacy. And I can see that Canada, in every one of its territories and every one of its places, is trying to actually tangle with that, wrestle with that legacy. And I do hope that we're nearing a point where we can actually turn down what has been handed down to us and say, like, we're happy it worked for so long, but this is not what we need for the future, and we're going to build something different.
Thank you, Adam, for joining us on the show today. Appreciate you coming on and sharing.
Thank you again for having me.
Today's episode features Adam Mongrain, Director of Housing Policy at Ville, whose insights continue to push the national conversation towards clearer diagnosis and smarter solutions. Adam's work reminds us that lasting change requires structural thinking, cross-sector collaboration, and a broad public movement committed to building a better housing system for everyone. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home. Stay tuned for more conversations with leaders driving real change across Canada's housing landscape. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and this podcast is brought to you by Blue Door.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.